You have been told Sodom was destroyed because of one sin. That is not the whole story, and the part that has been left out will change how you read the Bible entirely. What if the real horror of Sodom was not a single act, but a system? What if a city could be wealthy, functional, orderly, and still be considered the most dangerous place on earth? What if the sin that sealed Sodom's fate was not what most people were taught in church, but something far more structural, far more quiet, and far more recognizable? What did daily life actually look like inside those city walls before the fire came? What did people eat, build, trade, and believe? Who lived there? Who governed? And what did ancient sources, not just the book of Genesis, actually say about the culture that made Sodom what it was? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand justice, mercy, and the weight of a city's choices. Sodom was real. That is not a theological claim. That is a historical conversation still unfolding. The region known in ancient texts as the cities of the plain, or Kikar HaYarden in Hebrew, referred to the flat southern extension of the Jordan Valley, a stretch of land just northeast of the Dead Sea. When the author of Genesis describes Abraham standing far off and watching smoke rise from that direction like the smoke of a furnace, the geography matches. Archaeological work at sites like Tal el Hammam in modern Jordan has revealed a large Bronze Age urban center in this region that shows catastrophic destruction layers approximately dated to the Middle Bronze Age. Around 1650 BCE, the destruction sequence includes burned architecture, melted pottery, vitrified materials, and a profound absence of subsequent habitation for several centuries. Scholars debate the cause, but the site existed. The region existed. The destruction was real. What concerns us here, though, is not the archaeology of destruction. It is the archaeology of life. Before the fire, there was a city, and before a city can be destroyed, it must first be built, stone by stone, habit by habit, value by value. If you were walking through the urban settlements of the southern Jordan Valley in the Middle Bronze Age, what you would encounter first is not chaos or obvious depravity. You would encounter the ordinary machinery of civilization. You would smell bread baking in clay ovens and the thick sweetness of stored grain. You would hear merchants negotiating in the open market, the sound of copper tools against stone, children running between narrow lanes of packed earth. You would see walls, good walls, well laid, and evidence of surplus. Because if there is one thing that ancient sources consistently agree upon regarding Sodom and its neighboring cities, it is this: the land was extraordinarily fertile. Genesis 13 describes the plain before the destruction as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord. This was not metaphor. This was agricultural geography. The Jordan Valley corridor was one of the most productive zones in the ancient Near East, and this detail matters more than almost anything else in the story. And if you are watching this kind of content for the first time, narratives that take the biblical world seriously from the ground up, consider joining this channel. What we do here is not theology from a distance. We reconstruct the real world that produced the scriptures, and we invite you into it. Fertile land in the ancient world was power. It was not background scenery. When Genesis says the cities of the plain were well-watered, the author is saying those cities were rich. Not rich by accident, rich by position. Rich because the water supply was reliable when most of the ancient Near East was seasonal and dangerous. Rich because crops could be planted with confidence. Rich because surplus meant storage, and storage meant leverage. And leverage meant that Sodom could sit at the intersection of trade routes and extract value from every caravan that needed water, food, or rest. This is the first thing to hold clearly in mind. Sodom was not a village of outlaws. It was a city of abundance. And cities of abundance, in the ancient Near East, developed systems. They developed hierarchies. They developed institutions for managing who ate and who did not, who traded freely and who paid extra, who was protected and who was left exposed at the edge of the wall. The archaeology of similar Bronze Age urban centers in the region, not just Tal el Hammam, but cities throughout the Levant, reveals a consistent pattern. A significant percentage of the population lived in conditions of relative comfort. Grain storage pits suggest civic organization. Imported pottery suggests trade connections. Livestock bones suggest meat consumption beyond subsistence level. The elite classes in cities like this built larger structures, stored more food, and controlled access to the best pasture land and water sources. Below them, a middle tier of craftsmen and merchants operated inside the city's commercial logic. And at the margins, sleeping near the gates, dependent on hospitality customs enforced by social pressure rather than law, were the travelers, the strangers, the poor, and the displaced. In the ancient Near East, the city gate was not merely an architectural feature, it was a social institution. It was where elders sat and judged. It was where contracts were witnessed and disputes were settled. It was where strangers arrived and made their first contact with the social order of a city. The gate was the test of a city's character. How a city treated the person who arrived at the gate, exhausted, unknown, without local connection, revealed everything about what that city truly valued. This is why the story of Lot and the angels begins exactly at the city gate. And this is why, before we follow Lot inside, we need to understand what the gate of Sodom represented and what kind of system it protected. The ancient Near East had a code older than any written law. It was not carved into stone tablets by kings. It was not enforced by armies. It was maintained by something far more powerful and far more fragile. The collective understanding that the world was dangerous, that travel was deadly, and that any person who arrived at your threshold deserved, at minimum, protection for the night. This code had a name in Hebrew, Hachnasat Orkim, the welcoming of guests. But it was not exclusive to Israelite culture. Across Mesopotamia, across Canaan, across Egypt, across the Arabian Peninsula, the hospitality obligation operated as the invisible infrastructure of the ancient world. Without it, long-distance trade collapsed. Without it, diplomacy became impossible. Without it, the traveler who ran out of water 3 miles from the nearest settlement simply died. Hospitality was not generosity. It was civilization's most essential operating system. To understand what this meant in practice, you have to understand what travel looked like before the destruction of Sodom, before roads were paved, before inns existed in any reliable form, before any network of formal accommodation connected one city to another. A traveler in the Middle Bronze Age moved through a landscape that offered almost nothing by default. The sun in the Jordan Valley region during summer months drove temperatures well above 40 degrees Celsius in the open. Water sources were unpredictable. Bandits operated freely on the roads between settlements. A lone traveler, or even a small group, arriving at a city after a day's walk would be in a state of genuine physical vulnerability, dehydrated, exposed, unknown. Without local protection, they could be robbed, enslaved, or killed, and there would be no mechanism for justice. No system tracked strangers. No institution advocated for them. Only the hospitality code stood between the traveler and annihilation. This is why, when Lot sees the 2 strangers at the gate of Sodom in Genesis 19, his reaction is not casual. He does not walk over and politely introduce himself. The text says he ran to them, bowed himself to the ground, and immediately pressed them to come to his house. The urgency is not theatrical. Lot understands something the modern reader can easily miss. Those two men, standing at the gate of Sodom as evening approaches, are in danger. Not from the road, from the city itself. That detail, Lot running, bowing, insisting, is the first signal that Sodom's system of hospitality has broken down entirely. A man who has lived in Sodom long enough to sit at its gate, long enough to know its customs and its people, sees two strangers and immediately moves to extract them from public exposure. He does not trust his own city to receive them. He needs to get them inside, behind walls, before Sodom notices they are there. What does it mean when a man does not trust his own city to leave strangers alive through the night? It means the hospitality code has not merely weakened. It has been inverted. Sodom has become a place where the arrival of a stranger is not an obligation to be met, but a threat to be neutralized. Or worse, an opportunity to be exploited. The ancient prophet Ezekiel, writing centuries after Genesis, offers one of the most direct assessments of Sodom's sin in the entire biblical canon. It is found in Ezekiel 16:49, and it deserves to be read slowly. Ezekiel writes that the sin of Sodom was this: she and her daughters had pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of leisure, but she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. This single verse from a prophet who lived roughly 1,000 years after the events of Genesis holds the key to understanding what the ancient world considered Sodom's defining failure: pride, bread, leisure, and the systematic refusal to extend that abundance to those who had nothing. Ezekiel is not writing theology in the abstract. He is describing a social structure, a city with more than enough food. We already know this from the fertile plain, that chose, institutionally and culturally, to close its fist around that abundance rather than open it toward the vulnerable. The poor at the gate did not receive. The stranger who arrived did not find protection. The needy who appeared were met not with bread, but with indifference, and eventually, as the rot deepened, with something far worse. This is the architecture of Sodom's sin. Not a single act, a posture, a long habituation to the idea that abundance belongs only to those who already possess it, that the stranger deserves nothing, that the city's wealth is a private fortress rather than a shared inheritance. And here is what makes this particular sin so historically recognizable. It does not announce itself as evil. It presents itself as order, as protection of property, as civic pride, as the entirely reasonable insistence that a city has the right to control who enters and who benefits and who receives the protection of its walls. Every step in the logic sounds defensible in isolation. It is only when you stand at the gate with nothing, thirsty, unknown, arriving at dusk, that you feel exactly what that logic costs. Ancient sources outside Genesis, including certain texts preserved in the Second Temple period, describe Sodom as having formalized this cruelty into law. The traditions found in texts like the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer and other midrashic literature, which, while not historical documents, preserve cultural memory of how ancient interpreters understood Sodom, describe a city with explicit regulations against hospitality, judges who punished those who fed strangers, markets designed to humiliate outsiders, a civic culture in which cruelty to the traveler was not merely tolerated but institutionalized and celebrated. These traditions are not Genesis, and they must be held as interpretive amplifications rather than historical fact. But they preserve something important. The ancient world did not read Sodom's sin as primarily individual or private. It read it as civic, as systemic, as the failure of an entire city's moral imagination, and Genesis itself supports this reading. When the men of Sodom surround Lot's house that night, the text is careful to note that they came from every part of the city, young and old, from every quarter. This is not a mob of criminals operating outside the social order. This is the social order itself, assembled and demanding. The city has mobilized. Whatever is happening at Lot's house has activated something collective, something that the entire community participates in. What they are demanding is not incidental. They want the strangers produced, exposed, stripped of the protection of Lot's roof. They want the hospitality code annihilated in the most absolute way available to them. The strangers arrived seeking refuge. Sodom intends to ensure that the message sent by what happens next travels far beyond the Jordan Valley. That this city is not a place where strangers find safety. This city is a place where strangers disappear. There is a man standing in a doorway. His name is Lot, and he is holding the door shut with his body. Behind him, inside the house, two guests sit in the firelight. In front of him, pressed against the threshold, is the city. Not a faction of the city, not an extremist fringe. The city. Genesis 19:4 uses a phrase that leaves no interpretive escape: all the people from every quarter. The Hebrew is unambiguous. This is civic participation in what is about to happen. This is Sodom showing its full face. To understand the weight of what Lot does next, you need to understand what a threshold meant in the ancient Near East. A doorway was not merely a physical boundary. It was a legal and moral one. When a host received a guest under his roof, that guest entered a protected zone. The host's honor, and in the ancient world, honor was not a feeling, it was a social currency with material consequences, was now bound to the guest's safety. If harm came to a guest inside a man's house, that man had failed at the most fundamental level of ancient social obligation. He was shamed before his community. His contracts could be questioned. His standing in the gate, where elders judged and witnessed, was compromised. His sons would inherit the stain. A host who failed to protect his guest did not simply feel bad. He was diminished in ways that echoed across generations. This is why Lot does not simply open the door and negotiate. He steps outside and pulls the door shut behind him, placing himself physically between the crowd and the threshold. He is not just protecting two men. He is protecting the integrity of the only institution still functioning in Sodom with any moral content, the household. Because the city has already failed. The gate has already failed. The elders have already failed. The only remaining unit of human decency is the single house with the door closed. What Lot says to the crowd in that moment is recorded in Genesis 19:7. I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. The word he uses, ra'ah in Hebrew, carries a weight that English translations often flatten. It does not simply mean wrong or inappropriate. It means destructive, harmful, the kind of action that tears the fabric of what holds a community together. Lot is not making a polite request. He is naming what is happening for what it is. The city consuming itself. The crowd's response is equally revealing. They do not engage with his argument. They do not defend themselves. They simply declare that Lot, despite years of living among them, is still a stranger. This fellow came to sojourn, they say, in Genesis 19:9, and he would play the judge. The accusation is precise. Lot arrived as an outsider. He does not belong to the civic logic of Sodom. His objection is illegitimate because he does not share the city's values. And the city's values, fully articulated here, are that the stranger has no rights, the guest has no protection, and the man who insists otherwise is still, in the final reckoning, a stranger himself. This moment, this specific exchange in the dark, outside Lot's door, is the moral core of the Sodom narrative. It is not primarily about the identity of the strangers, though their divine nature carries its own weight. It is about what a city becomes when it systematically teaches its people that the outsider does not count. When that teaching runs deep enough, long enough, it does not stay confined to outsiders. Eventually, it turns on anyone who challenges it. Lot has lived in Sodom for years. He has sat at the gate. He has conducted business under the city's rules. But the moment he insists that the hospitality code applies, the moment he stands in the doorway and says that these two men under his roof have rights, he becomes a stranger again. The city cannot tolerate the precedent. It is worth pausing here to consider what the daily texture of this kind of culture would have felt like to live inside. Ancient urban sociology, reconstructed from Bronze Age sites across the Levant, suggests that in any city of significant size there were always multiple competing social factions. Merchant guilds, priestly classes, military elites, agricultural landowners, each with their own interests and their own relationship to the city's legal and moral norms. In a city like Sodom, where the agricultural surplus was exceptional and the trade position was strong, the wealthy classes would have had every incentive to maintain a system that protected their advantage. Hospitality customs, which by definition redistributed resources from the established to the arriving, would have been experienced by those elites not as sacred obligation, but as inefficiency, as a drain, as the kind of soft sentiment that other, weaker cities could afford. The gradual erosion of hospitality norms in such a city would not have happened through a single dramatic decree. It would have happened the way moral erosion always happens, incrementally, justified at every step by some local logic that made the cruelty sound like prudence. First, perhaps, a rule that strangers must register at the gate before receiving any civic protection. Then, a fee attached to that registration. Then, a category of travelers, merchants from rival cities, refugees from drought, those without letters of introduction from known parties, who fell outside the registration system entirely, and thus outside any protection at all. Each step would have been debated and decided by men sitting at the gate, using the language of civic responsibility and public order. By the time the system was fully formed, it would have had the feel of normalcy. Children growing up in Sodom would have learned from the beginning that certain people, travelers without connections, the poor at the edge of the road, refugees from outside the valley, simply did not receive. Not because anyone had made a dramatic philosophical choice to embrace cruelty, but because the city's institutions had slowly, over generations, made cruelty the default. And the people who benefited from that system, who ate well and traded well and slept safely inside their walls, would have experienced it not as evil, but as simply the way things are. The man who arrived at the gate with nothing was not their problem. The woman sleeping in the shadow of the wall was not their concern. This was not callousness in the emotional sense. It was something more structurally dangerous. A complete failure to recognize the claim that suffering makes upon those who have the power to address it. Ezekiel's diagnosis comes back here with full force. Pride, fullness of bread, abundance of leisure, and the hand closed against the poor and the needy. This is not a description of monsters. This is a description of comfortable people who have stopped seeing, who have so thoroughly organized their world around the protection of what they have, that the person who has nothing has simply ceased to register as fully real. This is what makes Sodom a warning that travels across every century without losing its edge. The sin it names does not require exceptional wickedness. It requires only the slow, unremarkable, socially rewarded decision to look away. The morning comes quickly in Genesis 19. The angels press Lot with a word that carries the full weight of what is about to happen. Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. The Hebrew verb translated as swept away is sapha, a word that suggests being consumed, gathered up, obliterated as part of a larger mass. Lot is being warned that what is coming does not distinguish between the guilty and those who simply lived among the guilty long enough. The city and everything it produced, its stones, its granaries, its market logic, its learned cruelty, is about to become one undivided thing in the reckoning. He hesitates. This detail is easy to rush past, but it is one of the most human moments in the entire narrative. Genesis 19:16 says that Lot lingered. The word used, maha, means to delay, to hold back, to be slow when speed is required. The angels physically take hold of him, his wife, and his daughters and pull them out of the city, outside the gate, away from the walls, toward the hills. Why does Lot hesitate? The text does not explain directly, but a man who has built his life inside a system, who has accumulated whatever he has accumulated, who knows where the water is and who owns the grain and how the market opens at dawn, does not simply walk away from all of it because 2 strangers tell him to, even when he knows the strangers are right, even when he has seen with his own eyes what the city did outside his door. The familiar is a kind of gravity, and Sodom, for all its moral devastation, was home. This is perhaps the quietest and most devastating psychological truth embedded in the entire account. The man who recognized the stranger's worth, who ran to them at the gate, who stood in the doorway at night and refused to surrender them, who did everything the hospitality code demanded. This man still hesitated when it was time to leave, not because he doubted the danger, but because the city had a hold on him that ran deeper than reason. He had negotiated with its logic for so long, adapted to its rhythms so thoroughly, that even now, at the moment of fire, some part of him was still calculating whether there was something left worth staying for. Lot's wife is another thing entirely. She does not receive many words in Genesis. She appears, she walks, she looks back, and she is gone. The text gives her no dialogue, no interiority, no name. And yet the image the narrative leaves behind, a woman frozen at the edge of destruction, turned toward the city she is leaving, has haunted readers across 3,000 years of interpretation. Jesus mentions her in the Gospel of Luke. Remember Lot's wife, he says, in the context of a warning about the end of an age, a warning about people who, when the moment of departure comes, reach back for what they are supposed to be leaving behind. What was she reaching back toward? The ancient rabbinical tradition says she was concerned about her daughters, still inside the city. Other interpreters suggest she simply could not release her life, her house, her neighbors, the daily shape of her existence inside those walls. Neither interpretation is wrong. Both point to the same root problem. She was more bound to the city than the city deserved. She had absorbed its gravity so completely that even salvation could not fully pull her free. The fire, when it comes, is described in Genesis 19:24 with 2 words that appear nowhere else in quite the same combination in the Hebrew Bible. Gofrit and Esh, sulfur and fire, raining from the Lord out of the heavens upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. The totality of the language is deliberate. Not just the people, not just the buildings. What grew on the ground, the fertility that had made those cities powerful, The well-watered plain that Genesis 13 described as like the garden of the Lord, that too is consumed. The abundance that Sodom had hoarded and weaponized is taken back at the root. Abraham, watching from a distance, sees the smoke rising. The text says he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. He had walked through that valley. He had let Lot choose it, back in Genesis 13, because the land was good, and there was enough for both of them. He had fought to reclaim Lot from the kings who took him captive. He had interceded with God directly on behalf of the city's righteous, negotiating down from 50 to 10. If there are 10 righteous in it, God says, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. There were not 10. That number, 10 righteous people, is not arbitrary. In later Jewish tradition, 10 would become the minyan, the minimum number of adult men required to constitute a community for prayer. The theological logic being preserved here is ancient and precise. A city is not just a collection of individuals. It is a moral community. It requires a threshold of people committed to the values that make communal life possible, including, fundamentally, the welcome of the stranger, the protection of the vulnerable, the open hand toward the poor. Below that threshold, the city is no longer a city in the meaningful sense. It is a concentration of power organized against the people who most need protection. Sodom fell below 10, not because there were no decent individuals. Lot was there, and the angels found him worth saving, but because the decent individuals had accommodated the system so thoroughly, had negotiated with its cruelty so long, that they no longer constituted a community of resistance. They were islands of private decency inside a sea of institutionalized indifference. And private decency, however genuine, is not sufficient to redeem a city. A city requires people who will stand in the doorway, who will run toward the stranger at the gate, who will name what is happening as Ra'ah, destruction, even when the crowd pushes back. And here is where the narrative reaches forward into the world of Jesus, with a force that is easy to underestimate. When Jesus sends out his disciples in Matthew 10, he tells them to find a household worthy of receiving them, to stay there, and to let their peace come upon it. And if any city does not receive them, if the city refuses the hospitality code, refuses to welcome the stranger bearing good news, Jesus says something extraordinary. He says it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that city. He is not using Sodom as a byword for sexual depravity. He is using Sodom as the established scriptural image of a city that fails the test of welcome, that refuses the arriving stranger, that closes its gates against the person who comes with nothing but a message and a need for bread and shelter. The continuity is exact. The sin Jesus invokes is the sin Ezekiel named. The sin Ezekiel named is the sin Genesis depicted. And running through all of it is the same fundamental question that the ancient world embedded in the hospitality code, and that the modern world has never stopped asking in one form or another. What do you owe the person who arrives with nothing? Sodom's answer was, nothing, less than nothing. The stranger is a threat. The poor man at the gate is not your problem. The woman sleeping in the shadow of the wall does not register as fully real. And that answer, compounded across generations, hardened into institutions, celebrated as civic identity, that answer is what the fire consumed. What remains after the smoke clears is not a lesson about which sins are worst or which behaviors require the most severe punishment. What remains is something quieter and more demanding. It is the image of Abraham, standing far off, watching the valley burn. the valley he once walked through, the land he once described as good. And it is the question that image leaves hanging in the air, unanswered and unanswerable by anything except the choices made at the gate, in the doorway, in the daily small decisions about who counts and who doesn't. Jesus was not speaking in abstractions when he said, "Remember Lot's wife." He was speaking to people who knew the landscape, who had walked past the salt formations at the edge of the Dead Sea, who lived close enough to that geography to feel it as a physical memory rather than a story. He was pointing at something that had already happened and saying, "Look at what a city becomes when it stops seeing the stranger as human. Look at what is left when the abundance runs out, and all that remains is what the city chose to do with it." The fire of Sodom did not fall on a place of unusual wickedness. It fell on a place of very ordinary selfishness, organized into a system, practiced into normalcy, and defended with the full force of civic identity until there was no longer a city worth the name. Only a concentration of comfort, surrounded by people it had decided not to see. That is the truth of Sodom. And it is, in the end, a truth that does not stay in the past.